Hi everyone, I am Sandeep and I am a PhD student at Monash University. Today I am going to present this critical autoethnography to examine how transnational education mobility produces enduring misalignment between habitus and field, which I conceptualize through the Bourdieu's notion of hysteresis. The title of this presentation is Fish in and Out of Water, Hysteresis, Belonging and Transnational Education Mobility. I use the metaphor of being fish in and out of water to explore how belonging becomes fragile, embodied, and continually renegotiated across educational contexts. Transnational education mobility is often discussed as a study of movement, opportunity, and eventual adjustment. Students move across countries, institutions, and cultures and are expected to adapt, integrate, and become resilient over time. Much of this existing research and policy discourse reflects this assumption. It tends to frame mobility related difficulties as temporary disruption that can be resolved through individual effort and over time spent in the host context. What remains less visible, however, is how misalignment between a person's disposition and the social worlds they move through can persist rather than disappear. This includes fragile and conditional forms of belonging as well as embodied and affective experiences that shape student well being in ways institutions rarely recognize. To make sense of this persistence, this study draws on Bourdieu's concept of hysteresis not as a brief lag, but as an ongoing condition produced through repeated movement across unequal fields. This framing allows us to ask not whether students eventually adapt, but how misalignment is produced, lived, and carried forward across multiple contexts. Before moving to the research question, I want to briefly situate myself in the relation to the study. This research draws on my educational trajectory across multiple national and institutional fields. The analysis centers on my experience of schooling in India and returning to Nepal, where misalignment, linguistic differences, and questions of belonging were first lived and embodied. Subsequent movement across educational system extend this trajectory, allowing me to examine how history is carried forward, accumulates, and becomes sedimented over time rather than being resolved. I ask how transnational mobility produces condition of hysteresis. More specifically, I examine how this misalignment is lived and embodied and how it accumulates over time, shaping the experience of belonging and well being across multiple educational contexts. And how is this belonging made and unmade across multiple fields? To analyze these experiences, I draw on Bourdieu's theory of practice, particularly the concept of habitus, field, capital, and hysteresis. Habitus refers to the embodied disposition we carry from past experiences. Field refers to the structural, social, and educational spaces in which those dispositions are enacted. Capital captures the resources that are recognized and valued within particular field. I focus specifically on Body's concept of hysteresis, which describes what happens when disposition shaped in one context no longer aligns with the demands of new field, an experience Bourdieu famously describes as being a fish out of water. I use this concept as an analytical lens to examine how misalignment is lived and negotiated in transnational education trajectories. In Bourdieu's work, hysteresis refers to the misalignment that occurs when habitus lags behind changes in the field. It captures moment when disposition shaped under previous condition no longer fit the demands of new social or educational context. While this formulation is powerful in examining dislocation, it often implies that misalignment is temporary, that habitus will eventually readjust as individuals adapt to the field. While I argue in this paper is that in transnational education mobility, this realignment may not fully stabilize. Repeated movement across national, cultural, and educational field can cause hysteresis to accumulate over time, producing an enduring condition of misfit rather than transitional phase. This study is situated within a constructivist paradigm, which understand knowledge as socially produced through experience, interpretation, and meaning making. Within this orientation, I adopt critical autoethnography as both a methodological and epistemological framework. Rather than treating personal narrative as self description, critical autoethnography positions lived experience as a site for analyzing broader sociocultural relation of power and inequality. Reflexive writing functions as a primary mode of data generation. These writings were revisited iteratively to interrogate experience, positionality, and relation of power as they unfolded across different educational fields. This reflective process was deepened through dialogic supervision, where supervisors acted as critical friends. Their sustained question of assumption, silences, and interpretive blind spot sharpened reflexivity while preserving my narrative voice and analytical agency. Data analysis was conducted using Bronze and Clark's reflexive thematic analysis, combining inductive engagement with theoretical informed coding through Bourdieuian concept, with reflexivity maintained throughout the analytical process. Together, these practices are understood as overlapping and iterative process, collectively held within a critical autoethnographic framework rather than as a sequential methodological step. This slide illustrates what I conceptualize as embodied hysteresis. Embodied hysteresis refers to how misalignment between habitus and field is first lived and registered somatically through fear, silence, and body vigilance, often before becomes available to conscious reflection. In this moment, fear, silence, and body vigilance were not deliberate strategies. They were pre reflexive responses shaped by earlier socializations and vulnerability. The body learned to withdraw before the mind could explain what was happening. Here, belonging is ruptured not through explicit exclusion or verbal confrontation, but through an embodied sense of threat that teaches silence as a form of safety. Embodied hysteresis therefore foregrounds how misfit is first sent somatically, forming the effective ground upon which later adjustment, endurance, or withdrawals are built. While embodied hysteresis captures how misalignment is first felt in the body, the next slide shows how misalignment becomes stabilized and governed through symbolic and structural forms of recognition. This slide illustrates what I conceptualize as structural hysteresis. When I returned to Nepal, I expected belonging to be automatic. Language, citizenship, and familiarity seemed sufficient. Instead, my accent became the primary object of evaluation. Being labeled Indian was not simply descriptive, it functioned as judgment. Accent operated as proxy for legitimacy, determining who could be recognized or as proper Nepali. This is structural hysteresis because the misfit was not internal or emotional alone. It was produced through the field's rules of recognition. Linguistic capital that had been shaped elsewhere was suddenly devalued. Structural hysteresis therefore reveals how belonging is conditional, negotiated, and governed by symbolic boundaries rather than simple inherited through nationality. This slide illustrates what I conceptualize as protracted hysteresis. Unlike embodied hysteresis, which captures the first bodily registration of misfit, and structural hysteresis, which shows how symbolic boundaries regulate belonging, protracted hysteresis foregrounds the temporal extension of misalignment. This experience describes a moment of acute crisis during the 2015 earthquake in Nepal, where the field itself ruptured. In such moment, recalibration is not possible because the social world that would ordinarily allow adjustment is suspended. Here, misalignment is not resolved through adaptation or learning. Instead, the habitus is left unsettled, carrying fear, uncertainty, and dislocation forward in time. Protracted hysteresis emerges when such ruptures interrupt the normal processes through which disposition stabilize. Misfit is no longer momentary but stretches across time because embedded in everyday expectation, anticipation, and orientation towards belonging. Protracted hysteresis therefore allows hysteresis to be theorized not as temporary lag but as a durational condition produced when repeated or unresolved field disruption prevent the realignment of habitus and field. It is through the repetition of such unresolved rupture across different fields that hysteresis becomes cumulative across the life course. Across these forms, hysteresis does not simply remain an experience of misfit, it becomes sedimented through the habitus. Through the repeated encounters with misrecognition and conditional belonging, the body learns to anticipate exclusion and regulate itself accordingly, as shown in this experience. Silence, vigilance, and restraints are no longer momentary responses but become embodied competencies, way of being that feel natural and appropriate. This disciplinary process shows how history is internalized over time, transforming structural constraint into durable disposition. In this sense, mobility does not only unsettle habitus, it actively disciplines it. Taken together, these analyses allow hysteresis to be reconceptualized beyond its conventional treatment as temporary lag between habitus and field. This presentation shows that hysteresis operates across multiple registers. It is first embodied and affective, then structurally organized through symbolic boundaries of recognition, and finally protracted through repeated movements across social and educational fields. Crucially, hysteresis does not simply persist, it becomes sedimented into habitus through disciplinary process that normalizes silence, vigilance, and anticipatory self-regulation. This reframing position hysteresis as a life course condition shaped by transnational mobility and unequal fields rather than momentary disruption that can be resolved through adaptation alone. This paper makes a conceptual contribution by reconceptualizing hysteresis in three different forms. This has important implication for student well-being, which is shaped not only by present condition but by accumulated histories of misrecognition and dispositional labor. By tracing how misalignment is first registered in the body, then organized through symbolic and institutional structures, and finally accumulated across time, this presentation extends Bourdieuian theory through critical autoethnography. The implications are that internationally mobile students' well being and belonging cannot be adequately understood through adjustment or resilience framework alone. Misalignment is deeply affective and dispositional, shaped by long histories of socialization and unequal field movements, which are often misrecognized as individual deficit rather than structural effects. So, this calls for institutional approaches that recognize student struggle as structural and historical rather than individual failure or lack of resilience. Here are some questions to ponder, and thank you for listening to this presentation.